I think this is kind of what's exciting about it, but obviously hard to predict in many ways because things are moving so fast. Part of what makes a good strategy is the fact that it's insightful. What brings you back together are those key principles, right? I think of product managers as being value managers, right? So it's all about that value chain. How do you go from building a feature to actually ultimately creating adoption, creating revenue, and if you do a good job at the cost, ultimately creating bottom line. So now we can kind of communicate with the machine the same way we would almost, believe we are communicating with the human.
Welcome to the Productized podcast, where we will explore the minds of the most innovative entrepreneurs and leaders in product management and design. For our listeners, take the opportunity to learn more about product topics from over 25 speakers and trainers at our upcoming Productized Conference 2024 in Lisbon, October 3rd and 4th. Tickets with summer discount are still available at www.productized.com. So today my guest is Sebastien Prioris, an experienced entrepreneur and expert in technology and innovation. Sebastien is known for his ability to create effective solutions and grow businesses. He has a strong background in digital strategy and leadership, and he's helped many companies tackle today's challenges and succeed. Sebastien will be facilitating a workshop at this year's Productized Conference titled Strategy, OKRs, Roadmap, all at once, at the same time, everywhere. In this workshop, Sebastien will address the common difficulties product professionals face in delivering a successful strategy. Sebastien, welcome to the Productized podcast.
Thank you, Margarita. Very happy to be back on the podcast and share more learnings with our audience.
Great. I'm very happy that you are here back. Last time was with Andre, it was not with me. Let's dive in, but before we do it, let's just start with a couple of fun questions. So, what is your favorite app right now?
So at the moment, because I've been traveling quite a bit, I've been using 2 or 3 different apps that are basically, helping me make the most of my travels. So there's one in particular that I've really enjoyed, which is called Night Sky. And the point of this app is just to help you recognize stars in the sky. And since I've been traveling a lot more to South America and South Africa for work, that's allowed me to discover a whole new sky, right? Which is very, very exciting. And also, it's great to see how artificial intelligence and augmented reality actually fit into our daily lives through those little apps, right? And how we recognize patterns, plants, skies, how you can be with your kids and see the International Space Station coming by. So that's kind of what gets me excited as well, like the sort of interactive side.
Yeah, nice. I have experienced the next Night Sky, but only the free version. But it's super nice to see where the stars are. And you are from aerospace engineering, right?
Correct. Originally, a long time ago.
Yeah, me too.
Okay.
So
you see more and more aerospace engineering people creeping up in product and management, which I think is a good thing.
yes, yeah, definitely. At least I hope so. Your favorite summer activity?
With a bit of a recency bias, I would have to say snorkeling with my kids in the south of France. It's been a really good experience. It's a family experience. Obviously, it's good exercise. It's allowed us to sort of discover more things, right? Like a whole new world again, which is always very interesting. And I think it's also good exercise in autonomy, right? It allows the kids to kind of understand that when they're learning to swim, actually there's a point to it. It's not necessarily just for the sake of swimming. It's also because they can now, it enables them to discover something more. Right, and I think it feels like output versus outcomes, right? So it's like you put in the hard work and you actually get to experience something really new and really exciting.
Yeah, nice. Great. So, Sebastian, let's catch up since last time you were here. A lot has happened since the last 2 years, since you chat with Andre. So, could you please share with our listeners what you have been up to since then, and what are some exciting projects that you have been involved recently?
Yeah. So I've had short interactions with really interesting companies like Global, who basically do the localization of your payments and your websites at one click, or with Juro, who do sort of contract management, all automated with AI, and more recently with User-Centrics, who do the online management of privacy and consent. And I think by the way, they're recruiting and hiring in Lisbon, which is quite exciting to see for the ecosystem. But I think beyond those, like a sort of short stints, the main the main activity I've been focusing on is really working for Satellogic as their CPO. And there the mission is basically to acquire as many images as possible from the Earth, right? As you know, through a network of satellites as a way to provide the right insights, right? But in order to get to the insights, all of that information has to be fed into sort of human and or artificial intelligence along the way. And this is what makes it exciting because obviously, it allows businesses to be much better at whatever they do. And there's a lot of domains where it's applicable. But at the same time, it's also quite exciting from a societal point of view, right? Because obviously the more self-aware we are as a planet and a society, the better we can drive the outcomes that we want for ourselves. I think what was exciting there is definitely the fact that, as you were saying, an aerospace engineer by trade or by training. And so there was a bit of a dream for me to be able to combine, my two passions, product on one side, which I developed for the last 20 years, and aerospace engineering, which was always my dream job. So that was very exciting. I think what I liked about it was also the fact that, it's hard. You can't send someone in space to fix your satellite. So a lot of things have to be done in a different way, which is one thing. I think the other aspect of it is obviously there's the hardware component. So it's not just pure SaaS, which I think is also very interesting, right? And the implications on that, on the organization, the timelines, of things that, how you do product management fundamentally. And also the fact that it's, deep tech. It feels like the sort of most exciting place you could be in as an engineer, right? Because you have, in that sense, very different disciplines of engineering, right? You have the software, you have optical, you have propulsion, you have electronics, you have a lot of things that come into something which is no bigger than a microwave, right? So
Yeah.
that is what makes it really exciting and hard at the same time. So that's been really fun. I think a lot of it is, in terms of things that I've been doing are kind of standard for a lot of the product leaders around, right? It's mostly around roadmap. It's about creating relationship between the product organization, technical organization, and the business itself. I think it was interesting to go back to the heart of product market fit, right? And putting in place things like customer discovery, making sure that you have the right kind of data, right? So you can have a lot of data, but it's a different thing to actually have a lot of insights. So how do you really leverage the data in order to learn and understand? That was an interesting challenge as well. And things that, you would expect, things like culture as well, right? Because you have such a large amount of engineers having to kind of bring them on board with whatever it means to be a product manager or product engineer. As a matter of fact, that was kind of exciting. And some things I did not really expect, like just working on the offering in an ecosystem, which also very much, enterprise ecosystem, government. So it's not the same go-to-market motion that you normally have, in a SaaS company. So that made it kind of challenging, but very exciting. And I think on the side, just, trying to give back to the community, I attended the product weekend, both as the retreat kind of thing, and at the same time trying to have a few, guest talks along the way to kind of engage with the local community and try to share.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing this. Can you please repeat the name of the company that will be recruiting in Lisbon? Because I think this will be important from our
Yeah,
for our listeners.
it's user centrics, right?
Ah,
All in
yes.
one word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Really, really
Okay.
exciting, really interesting. One because I think we all care about privacy, and it's very much top of mind for a lot of people, especially in the context of AI and things like that. And so
Mm-hmm.
really like trying to make strides in a way that actually works for the whole ecosystem, which is the end user, the company itself, the service and technology providers, plus the Googles of the world. That's something that is very, very
Yeah.
challenging but very important.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've heard of that, and it's definitely extremely important. And I see all companies and customers caring about that topic
Yeah.
naturally. You were touching on a very interesting thing in your last answer that was related to how your job differs from market to market, and that
Mhm.
goes directly to my next question, which is: so you have worked in many sectors, from luxury travel to language services in your in and also your current role, which is Earth observation data.
Mhm.
So from your experience, what are I would do this question in two ways. What are the main key differences in the industries and how you do product management, but also what are the similarities that make you able to work in such different um, sectors?
Yeah. I mean, you're right. They are very different businesses, right? Because from the outside, a lot of them could be pitched as just being different tech businesses. But there are some differences which are kind of standard in a way, like the type of customers, right? There's the whole range. Some of them focus on the sort of, more like almost B2C side of things. Some of them very much B2B, going all the way, as I said, to, the enterprise world and even to government. So that's one thing. I think the other aspect is the business model. Some of them are very tech at the heart of it as a sort of DNA and how you make money. Some others are actually a combination of services as well, or more operational in nature. So that kind of drives a lot of differences, and the type of transaction is very different, right? So if you need a thousand transaction to make a buck, it's a very different story than if one transaction is worth $1 million. So
Hmm.
that is the heart of what makes them different in a way. I think in terms of not necessarily the mechanics of it, but the sort of like the visible side of things. I think the things that are different are typically the decision making process, right? Whether it's very top down, bottom up, if it's decentralized, and how people go about making decisions. That's quite different. The velocity is different, right? Because of the size, because of the market itself, so saying because of the hardware. There's plenty of things that can play into that. I think the things that are most important and I tend to focus on are also the proximity to the customer, right? Because on one end, it's very easy, if you have a B2B or B2C kind of ecosystem to just go and talk to customers in the street. On the other side, if you're talking to governments, especially if it's more like defense and intelligence, then everything is redacted. So it's much harder to do things like customer discovery because, they're not very open about what it is that they're trying to achieve, right? So that makes for very different challenges, right? And also the culture behind that makes it very different because, if every customer is super important and brings back a lot of money, people are more adverse to risk and more willing to necessarily expose the product team unless they are very senior to the customers, right? So that kind of plays a bit into the way you do product management. And I think fundamentally the product role, because of that, tends to be understood in different ways. Right. So I think obviously if you are on the SaaS B2C side of things, people are very, accustomed to what it means to be a product manager, and you have the typical triad of, design and engineering as well. But I think if you go for something which is a lot more, hardware based, looking at government, with long timelines, it typically feels almost like a project, right? And so, the
Hmm.
challenge there is how to bring product for everything we know it to be valuable for into the world of product, project and engineering. So I think this is why kind of, the learnings in many ways are back to the first principles. And I think that's a way to be able to take whatever is different, identify it, and then focus on whatever is the commonality. And I think what brings you back together are those key principles, right? I think of product managers as being value managers, right? So it's all about that value chain. How do you go from building a feature to actually ultimately creating adoption, creating revenue, and, if you do a good job at the cost, ultimately creating bottom line. So I think this is what's common there, and you have to really kind of make sure then that you adapt it, right? Because
Hmm.
also to some extent the downfalls, the pitfalls of the companies seem to most of the time be the same, right? So having a ruthless focus is something that is massively important regardless of your business, right? And it goes back to the heart of the strategy. So I think those are the kind of things that bring you back together that are super important that you have to always keep an eye on. And I think, last but not least, obviously, if anything, it's more like first and foremost, it's all the people and the cultural side of things, right? And I don't
Hmm.
necessarily mean, I do mean people in the sense of taking care of the people and having the right kind of organizations, but also culture in the wider sense of, your overall practices, the way you think about your problems, the way you think about your solutions, and, bringing back into the mix this notion of, customer centricity, for example.
Yeah. And actually, I'm quite interested in companies that have a culture that is less developed, let's say. So, which is maybe like slower velocity, top and down decision making process.
Hmm.
Um, and that, like, how do you do customer research and
So,
how, yeah.
yeah, I think so. I mean, there's two things, right? Because normally it starts before doing customer research, right? Like the first thing is you really have to anchor the whole organization around what value means, right? And ultimately, value is proven on the market with the customers, right? And I think a lot of people have, can adopt this approach quite simply because they understand that, right? So I think the key thing is if you have someone that is very remote from the customer, right, who's very much focusing on engineering, for example, then the key thing is to, to take them along the discussion to make sure that they understand that ultimately everything we do is for the sake of the customer, which ultimately will turn to value for the company, right? I think a lot of people are very much willing to adopt that. And if anything, every time I've tried, you see a lot of engineers who are desperate to get in touch with the contact, to really get in touch with what it is that we are doing, because at the end of the day, it's like, why are we doing what we are doing? Right? So I
Mhm.
think the key thing is first to get that in place. I think the second thing is then to really, get that access to the customer, right? Making sure that people understand that, okay, if the customer is very twitchy, if we have to be very careful about who we put in front of them because of X, Y, and Z, then okay, we'll take those measures, we'll de-risk, right, which is a key part of the product manager's role. But at the same time, we'll want to make sure that whatever problem we're trying to solve, if we want to make sure that the solution that we put in place is the right solution ultimately for the customer, it has to start with the customer. Right, so there's a lot of buying that comes from there, and that second phase happens mostly with the sort of leadership group, or with sales and marketing, with customer success, making sure that we can work together to get that access, and at the same time balance all the risks together. And I think the third part then comes down to, okay, how do you do customer discovery? And I think in many ways, then it's the same kind of customer discovery process that you have, right? You're there to understand what it is that they do fundamentally, then come down to actually the problems that kind of align with your solution space, and then, go through sort of double diamond of discovering the problem, discovering the solution, and then putting things in place downstream.
Yeah. Right. So I could say that in terms of product strategy, there's kind of this recipe that you use no matter the industry.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't necessarily a recipe for the strategy. I think the
Yeah.
recipe comes more in the way that you can formulate the strategy, right?
Hmm.
And I think this is why so many people, when we talk about OKRs, are talking about outcomes, right? Because this is ultimately a way to think about, as I said, like, you do a feature, why do you do it? You have a meeting in sales, why do you do it? Right, so all these things ultimately lead back to the customer, right? For the main part of it, for the sort of product to market fit side of things, and that is a way to make sure that you align. Because fundamentally, the three main dimensions of a company are, customer engagement, revenue, and costs. Right, all of that ultimately is what makes the value of the company. So I think, once you have those things in place, then I think kind of naturally on the back of that, then the strategy more naturally aligns, right? Because it comes down to, okay, where are we focusing? What are those pockets of value that we're trying to unlock? What are those different product to market fits? And I think this is the key thing. That's why so many people talk about the fact that there's a big step between going from one product to many products, right? Because the real statement there is I'm going from one product to market fit problem to another product to market fit problem, right? So I think once you have that, then a lot of the strategy tend to align itself, provided that you have the right way to frame it and to formulate it.
Hmm. Yeah. And you touched on an interesting point that was the cultural aspect of companies, and that you need to agree on the value of the product that comes directly from the customer. And maybe in some situations you'll need to actually explain and explain what is the value, and why is important to talk with the customer. And this takes a lot of leadership skills, I would suggest.
Yeah.
So f- from your perspective, what are these qualities that are essential for product leaders? And so the qualities, my question would be, what are the qualities that are like the base for being a product leader? And what do you see any new qualities that people should pay attention to develop with the new developments in the sector?
Yeah, I think in many ways, I would say that the skills are the same that we have always known, right? So there is no magical bullet, right? So I think it's very much, understanding the market, understanding the users, like understanding the business, the data, all these kind of things, and the technology landscape, and putting it all together, right? So I think the skill is not those things separately, it's those things together. Right? And that makes a huge difference. And obviously, as a product leader, the main challenge that you have is, as all leaders, right, you're very far away from potentially the user, from the teams actually creating the value and building the product, right? So I think, being able to reconcile is a key thing, which is obviously why, where the stakeholder management side of thing comes from, right? Because you have to reconcile the expectations from the board, you have to reconcile the expectation, of your organization as a whole, all the way down, right? You have to go sideways across the different functions. So I think, being able to just, know what you're talking about and put it together and then
Hmm.
interact, right, as a way to connect with all the different parts that you need, that is the heart of what you're doing, right? And that is what ultimately, leads to the sort of the more strategic thinking that you need to have, right? Because at the end of the day, strategy is all about optimization, and people say that, as a leader, that's what you do most of the time. The reality is very different from that. I think a lot of people struggle to spend any kind of time on the strategy, which is a big problem. But, the strategy is a way to say that we need to find a solution to a problem. Therefore, it's all about this optimization, right? And I
Yeah.
think this is where that's why it's all about prioritization, focus, and trade-offs, right? But that's hence why the formulation is so important, to make sure that everybody looks at the problems in the same way, looks at the solutions in the same way, and thinks about why it is that we want to do those things a certain way in the same fashion as well, right? I think this is
Yeah.
how you can create that alignment, which is a key part of the product leadership role. And obviously, staying on top of all the trends. I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about AI, right? But being able to really understand what it means, what is going to change the whole ecosystem. This is what's so interesting, because AI is a technology, if you think about it that way, but actually it changes the paradigm in a way that maybe a business shift could bring about, right? So whatever will change the assumptions, the dynamics of what you're looking at as a whole is
Mhm.
also part of your role and the responsibility of the organization.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I would like to explore the workshop that
Mm-hmm.
you'll be giving at the Productized. The name you'll be facilitating this year's at the Productized Conference. The workshop that I referred the name about strategy, OKRs, and roadmaps. Um, and so, what can our participants expect from this session?
Um, well, I think at the heart of it, to start with the problem, as always, right? I think the problem, that's why I chose the title, is that people, think about roadmap and OKRs and strategy, intuitively as something that fits together. And the reality is very different from that, right? The reality is that typically it's done by a different set of people at different times with different tools, right? And that's kind of a problem, because it means that then people are having a harder time putting all these things together, right? And I think what's interesting, and this is kind of like the core goal of my workshop, is to try to bring all these notions together, right? So it's a bit too complicated to kind of establish the relationship in the podcast between all those different objects, if you think about it that way. But the reality is, like, they do fit together, right? And I think like part of the framework is, in one slide you can explain actually the relationship between all these things. And I think this
Mhm.
is the key thing, trying to take that one slide and to explain to people that, whenever you think about one of those things, it should always be done in the context of the other. Right? And to the
Mhm.
point that now I can't even do OKRs without thinking roadmap and without thinking strategy, obviously. Right?
Yeah.
So, I think all these things are sort of an emanation of the strategy. Like, all things, even a team is an emanation of the strategy. At the end of the day, it's there because there is a strategy, not the other way around. So I think the goal is to really make sure that, people get a chance to see what it could be like to work with those three objects all at once. And then in a very practical, easy to think of way that allows them to actually use it the next day. Because the key goal of the workshop is really to help, because it really felt like, I spent the last 10 years in sort of product leadership roles, and it feels like, despite having, had OKRs for the last 20 something years, it still feels that things are not clear, right? People
Mhm.
say outcome driven OKRs, sure. Objectives, sure. And key results, like, everything seems simple at first, and the universality of it seems to be even simpler. And in a way, it feels like OKRs have let people down, because now it seems that the full sum of strategy is summarized to OKRs. And yet, you kind of hope as the CEO maybe that just by adopting OKRs, you will now, be the next Google. And the reality is very far from that. And, people are still having to read books and, listen to podcasts and watch videos on YouTube to try to make it, put it together and understand it. And I think there is still here sort of knowledge understanding gap that we need to address once for all, because this is, so fundamental that it feels hard to expect a product manager or anybody across the organization to do strategy, to think about value chain, if they don't have the basis in place, right? Because you need to
Yeah.
practice that muscle. And the sooner you practice it, the better off you are.
Yes, definitely. I think one of the reasons why people feel disappointed on OKRs is related to the fact that they they're sold like this magical thing that if you
Mhm.
do magical things will happen. It takes a lot of work to define them, a lot of work, and then people define them for the next year. They don't want to change it throughout the year, even if the paradigm changes, because it was so awful to make them for that year that they just stay. And then in the end of the year, people go there and it's like, okay, we kind of like in the middle, we change road, we turn left, and were able to achieve half.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, when you say yearly, you're lucky if people look at OKRs in a yearly fashion, because most of the time it's just done quarterly. So that's one of the problems. But fundamentally, it shouldn't even be yearly, right? Like the key thing is you have a strategy in place. The objectives are just an emanation of that strategy, right? So and fundamentally, if you think about a strategy itself, part of what makes a good strategy is the fact that it's insightful, right? It really leverages those insights, right, in a way that delivers the value, right, in a competitive way and everything else, right? So the point is, when something fundamental has changed, it does mean that it challenges your insights, right? Which does mean that it challenges your strategy. So it feels a bit crazy that you wouldn't necessarily react. I think people tend to also worry about, you know, shifting left and right too often, are the team's going to be okay with all those changes? But sometimes you don't really have a choice, right? And if you think about what the teams need, they need the visibility, they need the understanding. So if something fundamentally changes, then you should definitely,
Mhm.
make them aware of it. Now, the challenge with that is that when it comes to, people realizing that something is changing, that's one thing, but then you have to formulate it, right? And that's where the whole process comes in, because one is, I think, again, there is a gap in the sort of the ability of people to formulate strategies. That's one aspect. And the other thing is then to, scale it, because if you change something, like one assumption at the very top of the pyramid from an OKR's point of view, right, which is to do with the market, it might be to do with your funding or whatever, then this will have ripple effects. So very often in many companies, you then have, so many different branches of OKRs, and, people worry that it's almost going to take, the focus away from whatever it is that they're doing. So the real thing that you're having to solve is, one, the process itself, and the other
Mhm.
thing is fundamentally, really assess the impact, as quickly as possible, almost like as a discovery upstream, to see how much impact you really want to reflect on the priorities, right? Because some teams might be better left off to their own demise and continuing whatever it is that they're doing, and some teams will have to pivot completely, right? So you
Yeah.
have to be able to understand that whole, range in a way.
Yeah, definitely. And do you think that these three topics, especially okay, roadmap usually is visible for the entire for most teams, but do you think strategy and OKRs should be like a flag showed within the company, like promoted
Yeah,
in their
definitely. I mean, look, if you think about all of those things, right, like, whether it's roadmap, OKRs, or strategy, right? They're all strategy at the end of the day, right? Strategy affects the whole company. It drives the whole company. So, it is strategic in that sense, right? Like the whole strategic, crafting, decision
Mhm.
making, and execution is strategic. So, like any other process of that importance, you should really make sure that you involve yourself, that you really invest in order to making sure that everybody participates, right? And so, and I think the problem is, like, most of the time people think it's just about, like, like I roll out a new system, right? It's just about that, or you just roll out a new process, but it's a lot more important than that, right? It really means that you need to do a good job until it gets to the teams themselves, right? If you fail halfway through, it's almost like having no grade. It's almost like having zero, right? Because ultimately you do all of that so that the people are closest to innovation, closest to the customers, actually can do something about it. I
Mhm.
think, yes, you do need, as a leader, to promote it, but this is what I meant by it's a lot more than just promoting the tool or the process. What it is about is promoting how we go about innovation, about value creation, and all these kind of things, right? And so
Yeah.
that's the heart of the job, definitely, for a product leader.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for your insights on this topic, and I am excited to for it in
Right?
October. Yeah. Um, so, on our last segment, I would like to discuss current trends and the future outlook of our industry. Um, last time we have discussed the shifts from the STEAM, STEM, to STEAM, STEAM in education. Are there any other educational or skill trends that you see that could impact the future of product management?
I mean, I think I would say it's less about skills than it is about education. Right? That's my own point of
Mhm.
view in a way, and where I'm at in my own reflections. But I think, things like we discussed, like STEM and STEAM, they are the
Yeah.
fundamentals. And I think I mean that in the sense that if you think about it as a funnel, right, you just want, more women in these kind of domains. You want more, diversity in the kind of understanding, right? And this was the whole discussion about art in the middle of STEM, right? And I think all these things are good. and we should continue to do more of that, right? Like there's no question about that. I think what has been interesting to think about, even with my own experience, is our education system really built to be outcome driven? If I think about it that way, right? If you think about everything you're doing, for example, aerospace engineering, right? You learn a lot of things. You learn a lot of math and physics and tons of different things, right? Because if you think about it, like to build a plane, if that was to be the goal, then an engineer actually could not in 3 to 5 years, learn everything about every domain that it takes to build a plane, right? Because you'd have electronics, you'd have, aerodynamics, you'd have the engines, you have, structural kind of for materials, and then you have even like the sort of meta layer of, management and how do you do production plans and all of that, right? And so I think we also at a time where, as I said, the engineering side of things has become so massive that it really brings a challenge to, how we do education in the kind of STEAM world. But I think more than that, it's really thinking about, okay, what kind of people are we creating for the future, right? And are they the right kind of people, which is what's interesting again with AI, should we actually push more for AI? And here, because the paradigm is shifting so very quickly, it's kind of hard to understand how you should adapt your teachings based on that, right? But I think, just taking that into account would really help, right? Like, just really to make sure that, either it means that we need to have, different curriculums that are, where you can reflect the diversity basically, or it means that maybe you have some diplomas that are a lot more in tune with the fact that someone has to put it together, right? So in the world of aerospace engineering, for example, there's a lot of system engineering, right? And it feels that sometimes, like there's a bit of parallel with the product management side of things, right? But if you are that kind of person, you need to understand enough to have the right conversations with engineering and other functions. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a specialist, right? Which is back to AI as well. Like how much of AI do you need to understand to be able to do a good job as a product manager for AI, right? So I think, like just having that sort of, wider conversation with ourselves in terms of like the education system we want to deliver the right kind of profiles, I think is the most important topic at the moment.
Yeah. And talking about AI, how do you see these technologies shaping the role of the product manager?
So in multiple ways, I think that the sort of the easiest way is just to think about AI being integrated into the tools of the product manager, right? So there's just a lot of different ways that now product managers or product designers, like the whole ecosystem can do their job faster, better, right? It's like just having ChatGPT if you want to write an email, if you want to discover an industry, whatever, right? That's kind of like the way you can think about it. I have a friend of mine here in Lisbon who is creating a company called synthetic users, right, which is about doing customer discovery using ChatGPT and AI, which is very interesting as well, right? Because if you think about, that sort of AI models being able to think about the whole data set and being able to extract things using natural language, then, that could be valuable. Now, the challenge there is that obviously, one is you need to learn some skills, right? Like what about prompt engineering and all these kind of things. At the same time, it doesn't really save you from having to understand what it is that you're talking about, right? And that is because fundamentally there's still that gap in terms of what the AI can provide today and what we could provide as humans. And I think this is the paradox in that because, one is we think that as humans we are perfect, whereas the reality is that even if we were to give the answer, we might not have the right answer. And on the other side, we know that there's still quite a lot of hallucinations on the AI side of things. So you need to have, checks and balances in place, let alone the sort of deeper side of things of how do you build trust with AI, right? So I think what's been really interesting that, which kind of links to the second point, which is more, having to integrate AI into your. And I think here what's interesting is in many ways, I would say that ChatGPT has obviously like crossed the uncanny valley, right? So now we can kind of communicate with the machine the same way we would almost, believe we are communicating with a human. But I think there it's more a UX change fundamentally, right? It's really something that you can, like a wrapper that you can put on top of your product that really helps you do that sort of translation, that conversation on top of that, right? But at the heart of it, it's, one is it asks the question, how will it do? Like, for example, voice, there was a time where we really thought that every house would have an Alexa device and would be voice driven. It didn't quite happen. So what about the chat as a sort of phone format, right? We'll see what it gives. And also just at the end of the day, it goes back to understanding the value that AI can bring, right? And I think this is what I mean by, you have to understand enough to really have that conversation and be able to understand how the AI could fundamentally or partially change the way you're doing things, make it more efficient. So a lot of the AI at the moment is about efficiency and automation and things like that, right? When you can almost prompt engineer the sort of algorithm that will make everything more efficient. But also there's really that play more on the quality side of things, right? What about insights? What about putting things together? What about noticing something that nobody else had noticed, right? So I think, this is where it's getting more and more interesting. Obviously, we kind of, it's like a first degree, second degree, and third degree, right? So today we're focusing a lot more on the efficiency side of things. I think the generative AI is more on the quality. But I think the real conversation is going to be about the trust, right? Which is why I was mentioning those companies when it comes to contract management, when it comes to consent management. Like ultimately, the responsibility at the moment, still lies with the human. And so understanding where that line is going to be and how it's going to progress is going to be super interesting. I think
Yeah.
this is why, from a trends point of view, at the moment you have things like multimodal, which is great because in many ways the data set is extending and it's getting to looking into pictures and videos, but at the same time, from an algorithm point of view, it still feels like it's very much sort of almost like what ChatGPT does with words, right? It's still predicting the next word, right? So it's a different thing. It's with images, but fundamentally it's looking at old images, finding a way to describe them, and then saying what would be the next image, right? I think what's really going to be interesting is, as I said, like how do you build trust, right? So that's when you really have to understand, like, be at the forefront of that and really understand what's possible from a technical point of view, right? A lot of people think about RAG as a way to control the AI, so almost like a sort of unsupervised, but there's a reference in there, and ultimately how like beyond the multimodal, the key thing is experiencing the world the way we are experiencing it, right? A lot of people have talked about how language, however big of a data set and however common, right, we create a lot of data by talking, right, but we go as a human like through a billion words in a lifetime, right? But if you now add images, that's a lot more. If you create robots that actually can interact with many more different senses and therefore many more data sets, then it's not just that they can do different tasks, they can then put it together the way we humans put things together because we're influenced by all those different dimensions, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is kind of what's exciting about it, but obviously hard to predict in many ways because things are moving so fast. And I think what's ultimately really interesting is as the tech is getting deeper, if you think almost like Unix used to be almost the front end, and now it's kind of hidden somewhere. The conversation is really like what does it mean for the product managers on a day-to-day basis? Because the engineering sort of thing is extending. Maybe the triad becomes like a quatuor because the AI is part of that. At the end of the day, it's going to be more and more sort of team sport, right? Because the complexity of the technical side of things. So I think again, all the things that product people have been focusing on in terms of aligning, creating value, kind of bringing things together, having the stakeholder management side of thing is just going to become more and more important.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Collaboration, I think, will play a huge role in the future as it plays today. But to integrate AI in the team's work, yeah, and as you said, it's for now it's about efficiency, and I think it will be for some time, like about how can we improve processes.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, Sebastian, it was been great talking to you today, with you today. So I would like to end up our conversation with a final note.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this or that game. I'm going to
Okay.
post to ask you a few questions, quick questions, and you just need to answer whatever it comes to your mind. So, morning meetings or evening calls?
Morning meetings. I try to, as much as possible, keep the evenings for the kids and family, so that'd be my preference.
Yeah, good. Digital tools or traditional methods?
I do love my pen and paper, but digital tools wherever possible. I think again, it's back to what we're saying. It's it's much easier to plug in the AI, so which means that it makes everything more efficient, right?
Yeah,
So you can go back to
yeah,
your notes, find something more easily, and so on.
yeah. Work remotely or in the office?
I mean, I work remotely at the moment. I'm loving it, but obviously there's still something missing. So for me, the sweet spot is really remote with face to face whenever you can do it, right? Whenever you can afford it. But
Hybrid.
you should, yeah, hybrid is really
Yeah,
the best at the moment.
definitely. Data driven decisions or intuition based choices?
Ooh, I have to say data driven. The main reason is actually think that people say experience is a form of bias, right? But in a way, it's a form of
Mhm.
data. So I think that if you have intuition, it's great, but it's just one of the data points, right? So you have to take your intuition, definitely have it, and the better you have, the better intuition you have, the better off you are. But then integrate it with the rest of the data. So I think it's part of the same world in a way.
Yeah. Definitely. And yeah, our bias can get fool us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Books or podcasts for learning?
I do love my books. I have tons of them, but I think I have to say podcasts, right? Like for work, at least. I think for pleasure, books. For work, it would have to be podcasts just because of the flexibility, the diversity, being able to find a lot of things and do it on the fly in a plane, train, or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's very
Yeah,
efficient.
definitely. Finally, three books that you recommend can be product or non-product related.
Yes. So one I've been reading recently is The Crux by Richard Rumelt. He did the Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. It's definitely the kind of book where you'll find the algorithm for how to do strategy. Right? There's some notion of that, but I think it's quite weakly typed, the way the engineers would say. But I think it gives you a good sense of what strategy is. Right, so I think
Hmm.
it's if you're willing to accept a bit of the fuzzy side of things, it will definitely give you a lot of examples to understand what strategy is supposed to be about and more about the optimization problems and things like that. The other one is product operations by Melissa Perry and Dennis Stiles. It's been quite talked about this year, and I think it's good to just keep extending what product is about. Like any discipline, it's kind of it's basically establishing itself and its practices and everything and how you think about it. So obviously, product operations in the way it's described, I think it's great for the fundamentals to really understand what it is because it pertains to the way that people should do product in general. I think then product operation as a real team and process and everything most of the time ends up being at scale, right? So you have to take that with a pinch of salt. And I think the other thing that the other book I was thinking about is obviously Awesome by April Dunford. Like she's typically known for doing sort of more B2B positioning, go to market, things like that. I think it's really interesting. One, because I think more and more product managers will have to really have that product marketing mindset, and that's because it's back to product to market fit in many ways, right? So I think becoming more fluent with that dimension is going to be important because also the second part of that is that more and more product people will become responsible for business outcomes. Right? We talked about revenue and cost
Hmm.
and things like that. So, and I think that also has like some interesting repercussions in the way you think about organization. If you look at Airbnb, how they merge product management and product marketing. So, I think this is kind of a good mix of books for someone to spend some good hours in the month to come.
Yeah. Thank you. What is the best advice that you ever received in your career?
Oh, in one, I don't know. I know actually we were talking about user centrics earlier. The CPTO there, Ibrahim Husseini, was saying to me, more companies die from by not being born than by any other process during their lifetime. And I think that it doesn't necessarily pertain to product per se, but it really resonated with me. Right, there's a lot of things that it's about trying, it's about validating, it's about going out there, to the users, to the market, and trying to create value there. So, that's the one I have in mind at the moment.
Yeah, good one. Thank you. And finally, how can people reach out to you if they want?
Easily on LinkedIn, I can easily be found. You can contact me directly, and once we're there, we can take it via email or any other means.
Yeah, great. Sebastian, it's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Same
Thank you
here.
so much for being with us today. And I hope to see you soon in October in Lisbon.
Yes, thank you, Margarita. My pleasure. And yeah, I'll see most of you at the Productized Conference in October, right? The 3rd of October.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
We'll talk
Yeah.
there.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.